Now to the latest in the investigation.
According to eyewitnesses,
killed just yesterday afternoon.
The teenage boy is now dead.
Investigators are still looking into.
Hello and welcome to Docual. My name is Riley, and this is part 2 of our Santa Cruz killer series. If you haven't already seen the first part on Edmund Kemper, it will be linked below. Today we will be covering the crimes of Herbert Mullin, the man responsible for 13 deaths, which he claimed he had to commit to prevent earthquakes from destroying California. Once again, please be aware this episode will contain violent and graphic descriptions of murder. Please view at your own discretion. Herbert William Mullin was born on April 18, 1947 in Salinas, California, the second child to parents Martin William Mullin, a World War II veteran, and Jean Mullin, the first being their daughter Patricia. Growing up, Mullin's parents were devout Catholics, and so at age 5 the family moved to a farming community in San Francisco, where his father worked as a furniture salesman, and he and his sister started attending parochial school. As a child, Mullin was described as bright and gentle-natured, and was quite popular at school. At home, his father would tell him stories of the war and would teach him how to shoot. The two would often box in the kitchen before dinner. Later in life, Mullin would interpret these matches as death challenges by his sadistic father. Mullin would interpret much of his childhood in this way, seeing each moment as a conspiracy led by his parents to destroy all pieces of happiness. He said that they were killjoy reincarnationalists, meaning that they needed to destroy all happiness to return in the next life as a better being. On one account, Mullin said, "When I was in the 2nd grade, they told me that Jesus Christ, the person, actually lives in the Holy Eucharist. It is a lie, designed to induce naivety and gullibility in young children, thereby making them susceptible to receive and carry out telepathic, subconscious suicide orders." At 16, the family moved to Santa Cruz, where Mullin attended San Lorenzo Valley High School. He had many friends at school and was quite popular, being voted the most likely to succeed. He played football and had a steady girlfriend named Loretta Ricketts. In June of 1965, Mullin's friend, Dean Richardson, was killed in a car crash. This would have a profound effect on Mullin's psyche, and is regarded as one of the turning points in his life. He believed that Dean's death was a sort of cosmic sacrifice, beginning to build shrines in his room to Richardson, growing an obsession with reincarnation and bringing his friend back. In the fall of 1965, Mullin began studying engineering at Cabrillo College, and that spring he would reconnect with some of Dean's friends, one of which being Jim Gianera. He would introduce Mullin to marijuana that Mullin would later claim damaged his brain. That summer, Mullin would get a job with County Road Crew and break up with Loretta, although this would only last 6 months before the two would be back together, this time engaged. In October of 1966, Mullin would have his first experience with LSD and begin experimenting with the drug. The following spring, he would begin obsessing over Eastern religions, and that summer he would graduate with a 2-year degree in engineering and enroll in San Jose State College. However, he would withdraw shortly after. He was becoming more ingrained in the counterculture movement against the Vietnam War, and in January 1968, he would register as a conscientious objector. With his growing activism and experimentation with drugs, Loretta would break off their engagement in March of 1968. In April, he would be arrested for possession of marijuana, but pled to a lower offense, receiving only probation. That October, Mullin was granted conscientious objector status after his father wrote a letter to the draft board telling them how peaceful-minded he was. And after having started work at the Goodwill, his time was credited towards his alternative service. In February 1969, Mullin quit his job and announced that he was going to India to study yoga. This would be a lie, and instead he was planning on moving away to Sevastopol, California, to live on a trailer on a ranch owned by his sister and her husband, Albert Boca. However, it was at this time that Patricia started to notice his echopraxia, a condition defined by involuntary imitation of others' actions. When my husband would eat, Herb would eat. Whatever my husband would do, Herb would do. And that went on for 4 hours. Then he just sat and stared at us. Following this dinnertime incident, the family would convince Mullin to commit himself to the Mendocino State Hospital, where he stayed for 6 weeks after being diagnosed with schizophrenia aggravated by drug abuse. He was prescribed antipsychotic medication, and in May would check himself out of the treatment center, being labeled with a poor prognosis. In the summer of 1969, Mullin would travel with another recently released patient to Lake Tahoe, where they would find jobs as dishwashers at a gambling resort called Harvey's Wagon Wheel. However, that August he would quit and move back to Santa Cruz. Upon his return, his violent tendencies could be seen firsthand, when he pulled out a knife on a forest ranger who had asked him to leave a park. For this, he was taken to county jail, but for unknown reasons, he was not booked. That September, he would begin treatment at the Community Drug Abuse Prevention Center in Santa Cruz, where he would begin self-harming behaviors such as burning himself intimately with lit cigarettes. In October, Mullin took a trip down to San Luis Obispo, where he met with an old colleague and friends. While visiting with one male friend, he was talking about his hearing voices and receiving messages, and then made an advance on this friend, who in turn called his uncle, who was a physician, who then contacted the county sheriff to commit Mullins at the San Luis Obispo County General Hospital as a danger to himself and others. On November 1st, Mullin would send a letter to his parents, telling them that he had been forcibly committed to the psychiatric ward. He would stay in the hospital for 8 weeks, being treated by Joseph Middleton, receiving a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. On November 23, 1969, Mullin was discharged from the hospital, with his prognosis listed as grave. He was released on the contingency that he attend the mental health clinic in Santa Cruz. In the beginning, Mullin would visit the mental health clinic intermittently, and very rarely attended the group sessions. And he would take his medications even less frequently. It was around this time he met Ed Lawrence, who introduced him to a commune in Santa Cruz. But due to his strange behaviors, the other residents became nervous and they didn't want him to join. He continued to hang around with them, and in the summer of 1970, he and a friend, Pat Brown, would go to Hawaii together. However, Pat quickly abandoned him, and Mullin would admit himself into a mental health clinic in Maui, where he was diagnosed with schizoaffective schizophrenia. In July 1970, Mullin was discharged from the clinic in Maui and wrote home to get money to fly home. While waiting for the money, he was arrested for being under the influence of drugs and possession. While staying in jail, he was deprived of his medication and became hyperactive and loudly singing. It was at this point he was admitted to the county hospital psychiatric ward. After this, the charges were dropped against him, at which point he had to be released, as California law limits holding involuntary mental health patients in custody. After going home, Mullin applied for readmission to Cabrillo College to study psychology, but failed to keep his counseling appointment, therefore disallowing him from continuing. It was then that Mullin started another spiral. He would shave his head, go on a macrobiotic diet, wear a large black sombrero while faking a Mexican accent. On March 28, 1971, he would spend 10 days in jail for public intoxication and resisting arrest. However, the public intoxication charges would be dropped, and that April, he was dropped from the mental health facility in Santa Cruz due to his failing to attend group therapy. He would move to San Francisco, living in decrepit apartments with alcoholics, drug addicts, and people with severe mental health issues. It was here he met a new friend, Alan Hansen. Hansen would confirm Mullin's belief on reincarnation and would fuel Mullin's theory that the voices in his head were telepathy, indicating he was chosen by God to do something special. In September 1971, he began working out at the Newman Herman Gym. He did some amateur boxing while there, and in March 1972, he received a permit to box in the Golden Gloves Championship. However, he would not be able to show restraint during the matches, having to be pulled away by his trainers as he would not stop assailing his opponents. Because of this, he would ultimately not be allowed to compete anymore. A year later, Mullin moved back in with his parents. He stopped taking his medication, and he believed the voices in his head were commanding him to kill. Fueled by a false prediction of a major earthquake bound to hit California, Mullins would continue to spiral. In a complete turn from his thoughts during the counterculture movements, he applied for both Coast Guard and Marine Corps. He was rejected from the Coast Guard after failing the psychological evaluation. On December 16, 1972, he would buy a gun after reading Einstein's book on peace. In it, Einstein talks about how in Switzerland, every adult male is in the militia and keeps a gun for their own protection. As he was a third Swiss, he felt as though he needed to follow this guidance. On January 15, 1973, he would pass the physical and mental exams for admittance to the Marine Corps, but would refuse to sign documents releasing his criminal records and was therefore dismissed. On October 13, 1972, Mullin had found a baseball bat in his garage. He took it with him and decided to go for a drive. He claimed he had been receiving telepathic messages from his father earlier that week saying that he needed to kill, and if he didn't, he would bring shame to the family. Driving along the roads in Santa Cruz, he spotted a man walking. This man was Lawrence White, a transient man born on the 15th of January, 1917. Mullins pulled over to the side of the road a little ahead of where Lawrence was walking and popped his hood, pretending to have car trouble. When Lawrence approached, he offered to help, and as Lawrence looked under the hood, Mullin struck him in the head with the baseball bat, killing him instantly. Mullin then left his body by the side of the road where it would be found days later. Mullin later claimed that White looked like Jonah from the Bible, who had sent him a telepathic message saying, "Hey man, pick me up and throw me over the boat. Kill me so others will be saved." As White was a transient and had no family contact for the funeral, there wasn't a lot of media attention or search for his killer. On October 14, 1972, Mullin read Irving Stone's biography on Michelangelo, titled The Agony and the Ecstasy. Mullin decided that if he were to be a serious artist, he needed to do as Michelangelo did and dissect a human body, in the aim to better understand the human form. And so he headed out once again on the search for a victim. While driving, he would spot Mary Guilfoyle. Mary was born on the 23rd of February, 1948, and was a student at Cabrillo College. She was hitchhiking that day in an attempt to get to an interview she was running late for, so when Mullin pulled up, she eagerly accepted the ride. Once she was in the car, Mullin would pull over on a quiet street, reaching for his hunting knife and proceeding to stab Mary in the chest and back. He dragged her body into a deserted area, using the knife to open her up and examine her. He would later say that his mother had given him the book that inspired the killing, and the killing was his mother's fault, that the book was given to him as a hint to dissect someone. However, his mother stated she only gave him the book in the hopes that it might inspire him to do more art as an emotional outlet. Mary's body would not be found until 1973, a few days after Edmund Kemper's victims, Alice Lee and Rosalind Thorpe, disappeared. If you want to know more about this disappearance, see part 1 of this series. Police thought all 3 girls' disappearances and murders were connected to the discovery of Cynthia Shaw and Marion Pesce, as they were all college women who apparently had hitchhiked. Unbeknownst to police, all but one of these victims were Edmund Kemper's. November 2nd, 1972, All Souls Day, a day in the Catholic Church to remember those that have died and pray for them. Mullins had been drinking and stumbled into St. Mary's Catholic Church in Los Gatos, California, north of Santa Cruz, where Father Tomai was taking confession. As Mullins entered the church, he heard Father Tomai's voice coming from the confessional. He attempted to force the confessional door open, but was unsuccessful. Upon hearing all the commotion, Father Tomai opened the door to see what was happening. The moment he opened the door, Mullins stabbed him in the heart, killing him instantly. It was at this moment a parishioner walked into the church, but upon seeing the scene, fled. Mullin took Father Tomai's rosary pouch and left the church before the police arrived. Later, the parishioner would describe the man she saw as a young man dressed in all black, a blur of black and blood. On January 25, 1973, Mullins was reflecting on his life, pinpointing the man who introduced him to marijuana as the representation of everything that went wrong in his life. He believed that the drug had caused his brain to malfunction and that everything that came after was down to that one moment, and so he decided James Gianera needed to pay. Mullin drove to the house that he last knew Jim was living in, but upon arriving, was met at the door by Kathy Francis, who informed him that Jim and his wife Joan had moved away to Western Ave in Santa Cruz. Thanking her for the new address, Mullins turned and left. Arriving at the new address, Jim welcomed his old friend in. Mullin immediately shot Jim, injuring him. Jim dragged himself upstairs to where his wife was taking a bath. Mullin followed closely behind him. Entering the bathroom, he shot the couple in the head. Even though they were both now dead, Mullin proceeded to stab both of them repeatedly. The couple would later be discovered by Joan's mother, who had been watching their baby girl. After leaving Jim's house, Mullin would drive back to Kathy's house to dispose of the potential witnesses. He parked his car down the road a bit, sneaking back into the house through the kitchen door, where he proceeded to open fire. The shots hit Kathy both in the chest and head, killing her instantly. The shots also killed her two sons, David and Damon, who were playing Chinese checkers on their bunk bed. As he had done with the Gianiras, he repeatedly stabbed the family after they had died. When the bodies were discovered, police immediately questioned Kathy's husband, Bob Francis. Confirming his alibi, they turned to him for potential suspects. Both Bob and Jim were known drug dealers at the time, and so Bob curated a list full of rival dealers and buyers that could be behind the murders. However, Mullin was not on this list. Neither Bob or Jim had heard from him since the summer of 1971, and so he was not on the forefront of anyone's mind for these murders. On February 6, 1973, Mullin was walking around Henry Cowell State Park, where he stumbled upon an illegal campsite. It had been created by a group of teenage boys. At the moment Mullin discovered it, 4 of the boys were there: Brian, David, Robert, and Mark, and invited Mullin to join them. However, Mullin was angered by their campsite, believing that they were polluting the forest, and so he demanded that the boys pack up and leave. They responded by laughing at him, and while they continued to talk, Mullin would later say that he telepathically asked them if he could kill them, and they said yes. Some reports differ on what happened next. Either Mullin left and later returned, or what happened occurred in that moment. Either way, Mullin took out his gun and shot all 4 boys dead. Before leaving, Mullin would take their .22 rifle and $20. A week later, a brother of one of the victims would discover the gruesome murder scene, and police would start investigating their murders. On February 23, 1973, Mullin was driving home with firewood for his parents, when he would claim he received a telepathic message from his father saying, "Don't deliver a stick of wood until you kill someone." As he received this message, he was driving by the home of Fred Perez, who was working in his driveway on his car. Fred was a retired fisherman who was born on the 10th of March, 1900. His family had lived in the Santa Cruz area since the mid-1800s and were known as the Santa Cruz Fish Kings. Fred himself had been working in the family business since the age of 12 and had served in World War I. He was a former middleweight boxing champion and judge, and although he had retired, he continued to make fish deliveries on Thursdays. Heeding the telepathic message, Mullin pulled over and proceeded to retrieve the rifle he had taken from the campers he had murdered weeks before. He shot Fred in the heart, killing him instantly, and returned to his car. He sat for a few moments before reversing and driving away slowly. A neighbor of Fred, upon hearing the gunshot, looked outside her window and was able to catch a glimpse of Mullin's car, including the license plate. Calling the police, she was able to provide a description of the car and indicate the direction it was traveling. It was this information that would allow police to quickly catch Mullin as he drove towards home and arrest him with no issue. When looking through the car after his arrest, police would find that the warm rifle was still in his car. Upon his arrest, Mullin was charged with 6 counts of murder: Jim, Joan, Kathy, David, Damon, and Fred. Police started to look towards Mullin for answers to the other unsolved murders, specifically looking for answers to the murders of the co-ed hitchhikers and a priest in Los Gatos. But Mullin refused to answer any questions. He would chant the word "silence" over and over. While being led back to his cell, he shouted to officers, "You people were responsible for the 3 million killed in World War II." He was examined by a doctor at the station, and they were surprised to see multiple tattoos covering his body, one of which read "Legalize Acid." All the tattoos were odd for someone who presented as clean-cut and hippie-hating. While Mullin was being held, police searched his home, finding a Bible, a rosary pouch belonging to Father Tomai, an address book with Jim's address inside, and newspaper clippings of the recent murders. The police and locals of Santa Cruz began to suspect Mullin was the man who was beheading hitchhikers and perpetrating all the murders in the surrounding area. However, 2 days after his arrest, the body of 2 more hitchhikers were found, and due to the skillfulness compared to Mullin's known victims at the time, the police determined that they must have been killed by someone else. By the time his hearing came around on March 1st, 1973, 4 more bodies, those of the teen boys, had been found and linked to Mullin, and so he was charged with 10 counts of murder. He was being represented by Chief Public Defender of Santa Cruz County, Jim Jackson. If you've watched Part 1, you may recognize this name as the same defender that would represent Kemper. As his hearing started, he tried to plead guilty. However, the judge refused the plea in a case so large. It was in this moment that Mullin tried to refuse counsel, insisting to represent himself and saying, "I don't care to be represented by a long hair," referring to the fact that Jackson's hair draped over his collar. But the judge refused to allow him to represent himself, assuring him that despite his long hair, Jackson was a competent defender, to which Mullin replied, "In that case, I plead guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder." After this strange course of events, the judge was beginning to question Mullin's competency to stand trial, and therefore sent Mullin to be examined by psychiatrists. It was determined that he was in fact a paranoid schizophrenic, as his multiple hospital stays over the years had highlighted. And so the trial was set to move forward, with one of its main focuses to be if Mullin was legally insane at the time of the murders, and if he was sane, did he display any elements of diminished capacity, meaning that he knew what he was doing and understood his actions at the time. While being held for his trial, Mullin was placed in a cell next to the now arrested co-ed hitchhiker, Edmund Kemper. Kemper would later state that Mullin was just a cold-blooded killer, killing everyone he saw for no good reason. He would go on to say, "Behavior modification, right? You reward them when they're good, you punish them when they're bad. So what I did was when he was bad, I'd get a cup full of water in a styrofoam cup and I'd reach it around and throw it on him. It's embarrassing, and it also gets his papers wet. And so we got this cat and mouse game. When he was good, I'd give him peanuts, and I tried to gas him when he was bad. It's called gassing." On July 30th, 1973, Mullin's trial began. His official plea was not guilty, and not guilty by reason of insanity. He would constantly interrupt the proceedings with disruptions and objections, as he firmly believed that he was not insane and did not like his defense trying to prove otherwise. While on the stand, he provided a little insight into why he believed the killings were necessary, by stating that if I were to prepare a chronology of the world's wars and famines and compare it with the list of major earthquakes throughout history, I would see that when death rate goes up, the number of earthquakes goes down. He believed that his date of birth being the anniversary of the 1906 earthquake put him in a privileged position to save the Earth from future earthquakes. And because he believed that Einstein's death on his birthday was a sacrifice, so that he would not be killed in Vietnam and would be able to fulfill his protection duties for the world. As the trial continued, Mullin continued to blame his father for the killings, saying each only happened because he was obeying his father's telepathic messages. On August 19th, the 6-man, 6-woman jury returned from their 14-hour deliberation, delivering a verdict of 2 counts of first-degree murder in the cases of Jim and Kathy, and 8 counts of second-degree murder. For this, he would be sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole. On the 18th of March, 2021, Mullin was denied parole by the California Board of Parole Hearings. At this hearing, he continued to blame the killings on his parents and upbringing. One person in attendance stated, "He lacks insight and shows no true remorse for these brutal murders." To this day, Mr. Mullin continues to pose a high risk to the community, as he did during his crime spree in 1972 and 1973, if he were released. Following this hearing, his next parole review was set for 2028. However, Mullins would die on August 18th, 2022 from natural causes. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of this series. If you haven't already, go and check out part 1 for the story on Ed Kemper. As always, if you enjoyed our video, please consider liking and subscribing. See you next time.